Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. I'm a little bit worried about Disc Priest going into midnight so far, so I want to catch everybody back up. Let's talk about what's been added, removed, changed around for Disc Priest, and I'm going to break down some of the builds I've been messing around with, or I'm kind of like thinking might be fun or good next expansion, and some of the problems that exist for the spec at the moment. So, real quick, they added, of course, the Apex talents for Disc Priest. The Master Apex talent is basically Void Shield, where your power word shield turns into a shield that'll shield 3 allies. And so it applies atonement to 3 total players, and it's a very powerful shield. On top of that, the Void Shield will reflect damage back at the enemies and trigger atonement healing. That also has another support talent, which will increase your shadow damage and your atonement healing. So it's a very, very powerful tool. It got slightly nerfed going into beta, but it's still an incredibly powerful shield that you can put onto people. It's like even way stronger than Power Word Shield, hits really hard, and it helps with your atonement healing, and it's fantastic. One thing that got removed was Renew, which was usually your single target atonement application, but what replaces it is Plea, which is same kind of thing as Renew, except there's not a hot component attached to it. There's also a new active called Inner Light, which may not be that new if you're a PvPer, but I don't know why you're on this channel. Inner Light is basically a mana cost reduction for your spells, and then you can Stance Dance, and you can then make it into Inner Shadow, which increases your spell damage and your atonement healing. Problem is, it's on the GCD. But real quick, some of the other big things that were removed: Shadow Covenant is gone, so you no longer have your pet activating your Shadow Covenant. You no longer have Dark Penance. You no longer have the Premonition active ability. You now have Oracle just giving you another charge of penance. You no longer have Powered Life. You no longer have Luminous Barrier. You no longer have Divine Star or Halo as well. As a result, that means things look a little bit lighter on our bars, but a lot of times abilities like Halo, Divine Star were just never even really used to begin with. Ultimate Penitence, Uppies, now competes with Power Word Barrier on the same choice node, which is kind of whatever, because Uppies has been bad for a while. Evangelism is a huge change, and it now makes it so that you are instantly applying a Radiance to your target, and then you can then cast Powered Radiances with no cooldown. This is probably one of the top complaints that I have at the moment, because it doesn't do a really effective job, in my opinion, of being able to quickly spread atonements out, which is sort of like their intention. They want this ability to be your minute-and-a-half cooldown that just allows you to put atonements on everybody really quickly. But spamming 8 seconds worth of Radiance means that you have a 10-second timer, and so the very first Radiance that you cast is going to have most of its atonements falling off or about to fall off by the time you can actually do any damage. So, not great yet. We're getting there. Oh, they also made a cool change for Rhapsody. This is where your Holy Nova would do additional damage, and it used to be this little stat tracker that you would have. Instead, now it makes Holy Nova a 30-second cooldown, and it just does a crazy amount of damage. So, really nice upgrade that they had for that. Just like you can have a nice upgrade to your own knowledge with our sponsor for today's video, Boot.dev. They teach you how to code from start to finish in Python, Go, SQL, and many other programming languages, helping you learn back-end web development in a real practical format. When I got my degree in finance, I had maybe 1 out of 5 classes actually feel like I was learning something that I then used in my internships. On the Boot.dev site, they know their goal is to get you ready for a job in back-end web development. And that means coding, putting together a lot of projects, and real work that you can use on the job. Their platform is also built to keep you engaged with all of these lessons. Also, having a lot of progress tracking with XP, leaderboards, where you can even compete for a top spot and complete multiple different challenges. They also understand that learning a new career or any new skills are going to take time, and that's why they built out tools on their own site like their Spellbook, which is the unlockable cheat sheet that you can fill up with links and notes for yourself as you go take on future challenges. So check out Boot.dev and try out any of their courses for free right now, and you can always save 25% off with code AutomaticJak for the annual plan. Huge thank you to Boot.dev, and let's continue with some of our M+ builds. I want to go over a couple things that I'm just playing around with right now. I'm not really exposing it to the rigors of math or anything along those lines, but some things that I've enjoyed so far. With this Voidweaver setup that I first put together, I realized that Borrowed Time's really good. When you have Void Shield, I forgot to mention this earlier, but it basically procs every other penance cast, at least at the moment. So every other penance, you get an empowered shield that's going to shield 3 people, which means that casting shield on cooldown or with something like Borrowed Time to increase your haste usually works out to be pretty well. Now, some of the struggle I have with this build so far is taking the pets and taking Shadow Fiend and Mindbender and everything, because Shadow Fiend's now on the spec tree itself instead of being in the class tree and all that. So because your pets no longer are activating Shadow Covenant, I'm kind of struggling to see the point in actually having access to them. I just wanted to play around with it just to make sure I can see how Void Wraith is going to perform and see the extra value that it's going to bring with the Voidweaver talents on hand, and maybe that's going to help a little bit more. That being said, I did make some sacrifices with this setup. No evangelism. It feels like evangelism is just an awful ability. You don't really need to have access to plea either in a 5-man because it's just, a single target atonement application. So if you can skip that, wonderful. It's kind of rough with the dots because they buffed pain and suffering. It seems like they've made your dots a little bit better, but it's also really expensive to spec into these points. And I'm going to talk about this in multiple other sections too. But you have these 2 side talents. You have Occultist and you have Purge the Wicked. They're on the left and right sides of your spec tree, and they buff up your shadow damage, or they buff up your holy damage. The problem is, even when you're playing Voidweaver, you kind of lean more towards shadow, but they also have made, your penance very strong, very powerful. And so it's difficult because something like Purge the Wicked is just going to buff up, your holy penance damage, and getting a 15% buff on that's pretty darn nice. Same thing with getting a 20% buff to your shadow damage, especially if you're playing, Voidweaver and it's turning your smites into a Void Blast, which is shadow. It's really, really high value. And so you're kind of caught in this odd situation where you kind of want to take holy and shadow talents together, at least what I've seen so far. And it seems like it's expensive to invest in your dots. It's probably the best way to put it. What's really cheap is to get talents like Castigation, Greater Smite, Blaze of Light that are just boom, here's flat increases to penance and smite damage. Here you go, no problem, right? And I feel like that makes your atonement output incredibly strong and just super bursty, what we've known from Voidweaver for a while. I have a couple more problems with it though. I kind of like Shadow Mend in the build, but I also kind of hate it because Shadow Mend effectively fills the same role as Inner Focus. Inner Focus increases your crit chance for your shield, your flash heal, penance, and radiance, so that direct healing gets an increased crit chance. Shadow Mend causes your Shadow or Pain to upgrade your flash heal to a shadow spell, and then it just does a bunch of healing and you kind of take a little bit of rot damage, but if somebody takes damage from an enemy or another source, it cancels that effect out. So a lot of times you're not really dealing much damage back to your allies. It's a throwback to Legion and stuff. That being said, it's one or the other. You have Inner Focus, which you can have as a flat crit chance bonus for a flash heal. That's usually what you would use it for in a Voidweaver setup, since you're not as shield heavy, but the shields do help out of something like Void Shield. Or you could have a random proc chance to upgrade only your flash heal. It's kind of one of these things. I want to put the Shadow Mend node here just to try it and to see how it works in practice. But in reality, I can't see a situation where Inner Focus wouldn't be automatically better. Or you might as well go into something like Inner Light and Inner Shadow and just leave it on Inner Shadow and you have a perma 10% damage and atonement healing buff, right? So I don't think that this build I'm presenting to you guys is going to be the best thing ever, but it's filled with things I want to try is the best way I can put it. And I think there's just a number of frustrations that come around when you're looking at how the build is trying to be cobbled together, because you have a lot of pieces of the tree that sort of get into each other's way. Now, I don't have a huge focus on penance out of this Voidweaver setup, but if I wanted to get Harsh Discipline, I have to go through Shadow Mend as a result, and that makes things quite a bit more difficult. I think you would really want to have Harsh Discipline as an example in an Oracle setup, because with Oracle, your new talent replacing Premonition gives you 2 charges of your penance. So when you look at the Oracle setup that I have so far, I start kind of going to the right side because I'm maybe I want to buff up, my Mind Blast and make that feel powerful and actually make it worth casting. But then, hey, Occultist is free 20% bonus damage onto a shadow spell like Mind Blast, or extra dot damage, and I feel like I can put a point into pain and suffering to try to make this lean a little bit into some dot damage. And that was a big point of emphasis I wanted to make for this build, is how can I actually, take advantage of the dot damage. But if I wanted to go any further to something like Abyssal Reverie for, the 5 and 10% atonement buff off shadow spells, it just does not feel worth it from like a dot standpoint, since my smites and penances and oracle are all going to be light spells. So then I started going down some of the left side for some of the light spells. Of course, Inner Focus, Divine Aegis, Eternal Barrier, all the extra juice for your direct healing feels insanely good. But then I'm kind of like looking longingly at Harsh Discipline, because if you got into a situation where there was crazy amounts of damage going out as Oracle, how you deal with that in Oracle M+ in the War Within is two ways. You have your Shadow Fiend and you kind of merge it with your Premonition of Insight and just kind of smash out a bunch of penances and dark penances. Or you have a, piety and an evangelism, like direct heal onto your allies, something along those lines. You're using like Premonition and Squid or Premonition and evangelism to make those things work. Those don't exist anymore, really. Yeah, your Squid exists, but it's not giving you dark penance to do tons of healing. So my thought process, or what I'd like to be able to do with an Oracle M+ build, is be able to access Harsh Discipline, but being gated by Evangelism, which doesn't feel like it has a place at the moment in 5-mans, and at least for what they say they want to do with Evangelism is make it easy to spread your atonements out in raids. I don't think I would even want to use that final version in a dungeon environment. Certainly do not want to use it in the way it exists right now in a dungeon environment. And then Abyssal Reverie, which is, the 2-pointer to actually get there, and it feels expensive for not having that many shadow spells anymore. And you have to use either of those to get into Shadow Mend, which is just a worse Inner Focus in a lot of cases. Then I get to go into Harsh Discipline, right? And that's what I mean by the route issue. This is how the talent tree is sort of made up. Is like difficult. It's like you want to go in one direction, but then you're sort of blocked off by some talents that discourage you or push you into an entirely new direction. And then you're not focused on anything, and then, you kind of have a bad build, right? So some things I think are actually pretty well positioned, like Wheel and Woe. Making it only buff your power word shields, I think, is a really good angle, and having it accessible by 2 different traits is nice. But at the end of the day, an objective, I would say almost perfect talent like Castigation, which is just straight up awesome, and it kind of leads to 3 different things, that also makes it pretty easy as well. I have it, at least at the moment, in my mind that Smite should do good damage if you're taking I mean, it really should. If you're taking Blaze, if you're taking Greater Smite. They got rid of the accelerated casting for your smites, where you would hit a smite and then you would cast the next one faster and faster and faster. They got rid of that, unfortunately, which to me was like the super fun part about this. But I mean, 2 points, getting a 50% buff onto your smite, especially when you are probably going to be spamming smite to fill out some of the downtime for where you're waiting for your penances to come up to do, hopefully, like the real powerful, strong healing, right? You would want Smite to be in a position where you could actually help people get topped off. I did mess around with some like Inner Light and Shadow, like I mentioned before. It's almost certainly, like, if you use this ability, you're almost certainly gonna sit in a stance for like a really long period of time. Like, you're gonna sit in Inner Shadow for an incredibly long time. And then, I don't know, maybe there's a boss fight like the second boss of Arakara, for example, where it's just all single target healing. The dot kind of jumps from one player to another over and over and over again. You just heal one person over and over again. Like, maybe go to a boss fight like that and you need to like flash heal a lot or something, and then you would just be in Inner Light the entire time. But then like the other 90% of the time, you'd just be sitting in Inner Shadow for the buff. It's kind of silly to even have stance dancing when it's not going to be multiple different situations where you would like frequently jump between them. But I have a feeling we're probably just going to sit with this talent in the spec tree the way it looks going forward, and you're basically going to sit in like one stance for a really long period of time. So keep that in mind. What else did I have for this build? I think that was kind of the biggest things. It feels like I could like spot heal well. You still have like the twin side effect. Oh, right. You have Piety baseline. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but 20% of your overhealing you do is redistributed to up to 4 nearby injured allies. I've talked about this in other videos. I really don't think this should exist at all. I really don't. But this is going to be especially helpful in 5-mans where you can maintain your greater smite buff, which only lasts 2 seconds, and not have to worry as much about doing some more spot healing because you're constantly having some kind of overheal redirect to help with what I kind of call like chip damage, where you might have like a small hit go out that takes somebody from 100 to 90% HP. They're still at 90%. You don't want to like cast a heal on them or something like that necessarily and stop your damage, but you really should because another hit could bring them really low really fast, right? It kind of helps with that, which also is going to be really important whenever you have like huge AoE damage scenarios, because if you overheal on the tank, it'll still be useful, effective output that can go into other people that are taking more damage. So that's beneficial as well. But I'm really worried about being able to balance that for raids. I wish you could just have like an off button for this thing in raids, because their ability to tune around overheal redirect is not great, unfortunately. Final thoughts about M+. I think the spec has some really, really good tools to deal with either like big bursty scenarios or to handle, you know, like triage spot healing scenarios. But at the moment, if you were to ask like, which do you think is better right now? I would really have to hand it to Oracle. I think having Twin Sight baked in, double charge of penance, especially when you can control, sort of pseudo control, when you get your void shields, because it's about every other penance cast, or it's almost exactly every other penance cast. You can do a lot to plan around your healing. You can just like penance, you get an empowered shield, you shield these 3 players, you defensive penance, you know, the 4th player or something that didn't receive a shield, if, you know, they might be like a DPS or something like that, who didn't get a shield before a major damage event, and then you can just make sure you defensive penance them to take care of them from that incoming damage. Your shields are just incredibly strong. You have a lot of different ways to like store up healing and get ready for it. And it's also just simpler to play than it was in The War Within. So a lot of good tools. The other side of it is that I feel like the Voidweaver type setup kind of stumbles over itself, at least in trying to find talents that feel like really strong or really effective. I almost feel like dots need to be a really strong part of one of them, because if they don't offer some kind of like Shadow Word Pain buffing talent to one of the hero talents, I think that the spec is just always gonna like have very meager value out of their dots. And so I would much rather, you know, like Oracle have like next to no value from their dots, or even like something that gives them like a perma dot that you never have to refresh, but it does like super low damage or something like that. And then Voidweaver gets a more active dot that you have to play around. I don't know. I feel like dots should be a bigger thing in 5-mans than in raids, of course. So it's a little disappointing that it doesn't feel like it's easy to route into a dot focus build, and still feels like some talents that are supporting your dots are just like not that strong right now, or are a huge investment relative to other builds. Okay, so let's talk about Oracle. I know I mentioned before, they have their overheal redirect out of Piety, so 20% of any overhealing you do gets redistributed. Super insanely powerful. In a raid build for the spec tree here, I did run with Plea to make sure that I had that for like the active setup of your atonement healing. I did mess around with evangelism, and it's still really frustrating, but I think you basically are stuck with something like Enduring Luminescence, just in general, but especially if you're running with something like evangelism where you just need to spam out as many radiances as you possibly can. At the moment, I think you could make just a mash radiance type of setup work with the current evangelism, but I really hope that they change it, because spamming radiance 5 times or something like that just does not sound fun. And sure, maybe slightly better than applying 10 individual atonements and then double radiancing and then damaging and all this complicated sequence, but it really just like does not go far enough in being able to make it so that your setup for healing every minute and a half is super smooth, super chill, super easy. In fact, we kind of go backwards, because I felt like the overloaded with light talent for uppies, where it would just apply 10 atonements, was really good for a lot of new players, and them just kind of like seeing how atonement works. Even if it wasn't the best performing talent in a lot of cases, it still was one of those things that like stands out of like, wow, you could actually make atonement application really easy. And then, you know, this talent does not do that yet. That being said, I do really like the setup that is possible for Oracle, especially because it gives me some vibes of like BFA, with Greater Smite, Blaze Light, really high investment in like smite damage talents and smite buffs, basically, so that hopefully in my dream world, your smites are actually going to feel like they can push up health bars and raid and feel like an effective part of your ramp. Now, I think Penance is going to be an absurd amount of your output, especially because of talents like Holy Ray, which we haven't mentioned yet, but every successive Penance Bolt during a channel deals 5% increased damage and healing. So that means that the later bolts of your Penance are going to be hitting incredibly hard. It also means you really want to fire more bolts. You want to get to Harsh Discipline, and I find myself kind of struggling to properly get there. You could certainly be in a situation where you give up the Greater Smite talents, and you give up maybe like Wheel and Woe or something along those lines. Maybe you give up like the Reflect if the Void Shield Reflect doesn't happen, because you can also use the Apex talents to go into your spec tree a little bit further. So that might be another like good wrinkle for the spec. That being said, if you're running with an Oracle build, you really do want to run Harsh Discipline. And so I wanted to put in some of the talents that I like, but also kind of get your guys' thoughts as to what would you drop to get into Shadowmen and into Harsh Discipline. I think it'd be the Greater Smite talents, but I'll leave it to you guys as well in the comments. That being said, it feels like it's really difficult to even get into that. Oracle should be in the position that it should be like the easy mode setup for the spec, because you're getting longer atonement durations out of your Oracle passives. You get 4 extra seconds of atonement. You have 2 charges of penance. You basically just like, honestly, you kind of don't have to Mind Blast anymore. You do get a Dark Indulgence for like the extra damage for your Power of the Dark Side, but it's only 20% additional damage. So you might even be able to skip that entirely when you're playing an Oracle setup and just like not worry about Mind Blast, or it's like an ultra low prio, depending on if you're running some Smite talents or something. I think something like that is possible though, because you could just start skipping a lot of those like shadow focused talents if you can get away with it, right? But then you would just like penance twice, and then you would do all your healing, and then you would be hard chilling, and it would feel fantastic. So there's something out there for sure. This is the spec tree setup that I like so far, but if they could find a way to like maneuver Harsh Discipline, I personally think it should be in like the Wheel and Woe position, and then maybe make Wheel and Woe, honestly, they could probably even make Wheel and Woe like 1 rank up, so it's going to be on the same like level as like Inner Focus, Castigation, something along those lines. Because I think there's just, I don't know, a lot of good situations where you'd want to have it, but it feels like it's having it on the same row as Harsh Discipline, which are just synergistic talents, makes it really frustrating. So something's got to move around for him. But this is probably the more prominent build. I think Oracle is going to be the stronger at the moment for my like raid testing. I think Piety, for one, is really ridiculous. The longer atonement durations and not having the old evangelism extension makes a huge difference. You were not as dependent on the pet being valuable as like Voidweaver was. And I think you sort of make the transition as Oracle out of that really easily so far. So obviously we'll see whenever we get into raid testing. The setup I was wanting to mess around with, at least to start with, for any Voidweaver raid stuff was right here. We are still taking the pets, because again, I want to see how like Void Wraith is going to work in practice with how much atonement healing is it going to be bringing to you, how much value for 3 points of investment, which is really, really expensive. Again, not being able to take something like Harsh Discipline and having to go into Shadowmen feels like a really big sacrifice, especially because I think Shadowmen and having that talent in a Voidweaver setup is just really not that helpful. Whenever you're in downtime, you want to be dealing extra damage. You want to be making the most out of your mini ramps around your Mind Blast cooldown as well. And you probably are going to be casting a lot of Smite during your downtime, and probably not going out of your way to cast Flash Heals if you can help it. Assuming that like Mind Blast's mana cost is going to be like decently impactful, something along those lines. You could always drop Sanctuary, go into something like Shield Discipline if mana actually ends up becoming a factor. I always find in raid testing that you don't have as much mana as you need, but that sort of levels off in raids in retail whenever you actually get into the raid and you actually see things there. So we'll see. That being said, I messed around with some of the, like the Shadow or Pain talents, but ultimately, especially at the mid-level, it feels like it's really expensive to invest those points when you have 1 point for Occultist for shadow damage. And then if you're going to have holy damage still out of your penances, then why not take Purge the Wicked for the extra holy damage? Same sort of thing, especially if you have just a number of like free talents that work with it. Like I think the shadow and holy damage talents are so strong that it feels like you might as well just move them up a rank, because they don't really feel like too much of a choice, at least at the moment. If I was going to sum up some of the big problems that I see with this priest so far, it's that evangelism is not performing in the way that they want it to make sure it's like a good cooldown to quickly set up your atonements in advance. It feels like it kind of just misses. Uppies feels like it also is a huge miss. A lot of talents feel like they're sort of gating each other and that it's more difficult to put together a really coherent setup without running over talents that you just don't really care for in the process. It feels like you have to jump into talents that you don't really care that much about to get the ones that you really, really want. So maybe it's like the rows and like the balance of the talents, at least as it exists so far. I also don't think it's a bad thing if Oracle's going with mostly left talents and like Voidweaver's going with mostly right. I don't think there should be any big restriction or something like that, or having to take some like cross synergy or off synergy talents to get to the ones you really want. I kind of hope that they make that a little bit more clear going forward. It also seems like Voidweaver should be the one that really cares about having the pet. So I don't know if Void Wraith needs to be like really, really buffed or something like that on the Voidweaver hero talent tree. But at the same time, is that going to mean that your Rift feels less impactful or your Void Blast feels less impactful? I don't really know where they're finding the power for the pet at the moment, but leaving them in, I understand. They just have to have, I don't know, something to make that sort of difference. Maybe they need to roll in the Shadow Covenant effect, but it needs to be reduced in some way or less valuable in some way. I mean, maybe you're really incentivized to turn your penance into a dark penance whenever you're Voidweaver, but you don't really care about it at all when you play as Oracle. Something along those lines I think would make a lot of sense. That way you could have all the shadow spells with Voidweaver and then all the light spells with Oracle and have a better balance there. And I know it kind of goes hand in hand as well with evangelism, but this is really their opportunity to change disc for not only the next expansion, but also the next like 4, 5, 6 years if they really wanted to. This kind of goes in these cycles of like a couple of major changes in one expansion get continued for long periods of time. We saw it, you know, with Legion when like the 7.2.5 patch came out. That was when they really got into individually apply all these atonements, then extend them and then go. And now we're moving out of that region in its entirety, and it's changed a number of different times in small ways, but you basically were applying 10 individual atonements, double radiancing and evangelism for like 8 years or something crazy like that. So this is their opportunity to set things up actually for like the next 6 to 8 years. This is also the opportunity if they wanted to make a cooldown where you could quickly apply atonements or even instantly apply huge amounts of atonement to the raid in its entirety. You could have that. You could have talents that are applying a lot more atonement with radiance, but it could make your single target application much more expensive, or it could even remove it. You could even, you know, have something compete on the plea node where you can have additional applications of atonement, or you could have plea or something like that. Find a way to make those competitive with each other or different from each other. There's definitely some weird things on the talent tree. I just don't really care for the PvP talent of Inner Light and Shadow. Maybe the PvPers will like not having to spend a point on it, something along those lines. But a lot of those don't quite make much sense. We'll see what the next build's gonna bring, because I would not be shocked to see some pretty substantial updates for this coming. And we'll have all the coverage, so be sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying these kind of videos, and I might do some more deep dives and talk over some of the builds I've been playing with or thinking about messing around with. Huge love to Boot.dev for sponsoring today's video. Thanks to you guys for checking it out, and thanks to our patrons for supporting. Take it easy, guys.